I am only what time and circumstance made me. Son of a lost house, friend to a fallen king. Some will tell you that we are the product of our choices. I've never found that to be the case.
The Dunmer were known for being struck with misfortune from the complete beginning of their existence, but they've always collectively inherited adept levels of combative and magical finesse, which, if refined, would result in insanely proficient assassins, wizards, and even unfazed warriors. The tribunal shaped Dunmeri society into the historical image that we possess of them as of the Fourth Era. Each tribune respectively carried and represented a multitude of skill sets, the same skill sets which signified their unique appearance amongst the ashen-skinned people of Morrowind. These skill sets would also inadvertently impact their behavior towards the divinity they have acquired, which will unravel shortly. Sotha Sil in particular became the most humble tribune, constantly placing his divine attributes into sources which would benefit his people progressively. He was known for utilizing his endless roots of knowledge to benefit Tamrielic humanity as a whole, not just Dunmeri society. He treasured his ingenuity and successfully recognized how influential mortals could become if given the figurative tools to thrive, and this is what he envisioned for his esteemed pet project, the Clockwork City. Sotha Sil, or Lord Set, was a wizard mystic god of the Dunmer, and if what I'm about to say even is a real term, he's one of the most mysteriously transparent figures of Tamrielic history. The numerous titles he harbored perfectly describe all of his achievements simultaneously. He's an architect of time, the inspiration of craft and sorcery, the light of knowledge, the father of mysteries, the Clockwork God, and the first binder of Oblivion. His influence even reached the enigmatic order of Psijic wizards on the Isle of Artaeum in the Somerset Isles. He took it upon himself to expand the knowledge of an already ancient magical order thought to have been the peak of mysticism during the First Era. His intelligence and personality probably contributed to the slow elimination of destructive elitism and racial prejudice the Psijic order was formed from, making them the dominant powerhouse of the arcane art of mysticism. The wisdom he emitted outlined his understanding of the world and of the consequences that came with acquiring a condemned sense of divinity.
I am whatever the people need me to be. A guardian, an oppressor. For some, too distant. For others, too meddlesome. I am the canvas upon which they paint their dreams and resentments. A vessel for their hopes and doubts. A mirror, nothing more.
Sotha Sil was born in the formerly prominent town of Al Sotha. This town was home to House Sotha, one of the earliest great houses which dated back to the beginning of Khmer civilization. Sotha grew up alongside a loving family, the same family that would later be incinerated by the infamous Daedric Prince of Destruction, Mehrunes Dagon. Even as a child, Sotha Sil quickly adapted to the emotional sentiment of others, learning that his actions, may that be indirectly or directly, heavily affect his targeted point of interest. For example, Sotha Sil recalls that as a child, he would occasionally play in Kwama egg mines, and these mines were home to little larvae called scribs. He would take rocks and throw them at the little scribs in an act of playful entertainment. But somehow, little Sotha Sil felt the scrib begging him to cease, begging him to stop the torment of getting rocks thrown at them, for its painful torment. This gave little Sotha Sil the realization of how easily one could lose himself in his own primitive perception of the world. His own mentality animated the scrib to convey a metaphysical message of wise philosophy. Other instances had him counting the stars on a lonely night, but due to his interest in math, he individually counted and named the stars in question, but fell asleep shortly after. His awakening in the morning was greeted by vanishing stars, stars which started metaphorically weeping in light of his absence throughout the night. All of these encounters taught a young Sotha Sil the importance of perspective. This is the same outlook on life that would allow him to unbiasedly explore different avenues of knowledge, thus why people refer to him as the Light of Knowledge. I personally believe Sotha Sil was destined to become a wise leader of the Mystic. Maybe not alongside divinity, but he ultimately reaped what he sowed. As most of you know from my previous video on Dagoth, the Tribunal consists of Almalexia, Vivek, and our topic, Sotha Sil. The Tribunal, alongside Indoril Nerevar, were all involved in the War of the First Council against the Dwemer, a war which ended with Indoril Nerevar supposedly dead by the hands of Dagoth. But Nerevar's dying wish was for the heart of Lorkhan to never be exploited and for Kagranak's tools to be locked away indefinitely. This was Nerevar's wish as much as it was Azura's, a Daedric prince the Chimer religiously relied on. After the death of Indoril Nerevar, his lieutenants directly disobeyed an order from their general and godmother, leaving the heart to their mercy, doing exactly the opposite of what Nerevar had envisioned for the heart of Lorkhan. They exploited it for their own gain. With the Dwemer gone and nearly the entire Chimer race distraught by the death of their king, his lieutenants had to represent themselves as omnipotent forces. They used Kagranak's tools to attain divine capabilities in hopes of granting their people gods to unite under. At least that's their justification of the sacrilegious act that was committed. At first, Sotha Sil was immensely empowered by divinity. He personally banished Azura by proclaiming her worthlessness as a god. He was adamant about disconnecting the Chimer from Daedric influencers, and as a result of Azura's defilement, what soon ensued would be known as Azura's Curse, a transformation of the Chimer's golden beige skin into a mess of grey ash. Sotha Sil probably suspected such a thing would happen, but felt guilty for participating in this curse as one of the sole proprietors of it. Nonetheless, Sotha Sil taught his people to embrace this transformation as a blessing, a way for mortals to directly communicate with their gods. He assured this newly colored race of Mer that their dilemmas will not go unanswered. Also, one thing that shouldn't stay between blurred lines is the fact that Sotha Sil had the ability to resist the curse, but he felt obliged to help his people cope by turning into a Dunmer himself.
This city serves a noble goal, the redemption of Tamriel, the unification of competing forces, the destruction of the Daedra. Unfortunately, it is an endeavor built upon a lattice of corpses, betrayal, untold horrors. Do you understand?
After the unexpected rise of the Tribunal after the Battle of Red Mountain, Sotha Sil and his fellow Tribunes had to find a renewed place to call home, and this led to the creation of Sotha Sil's signature settlement, the Clockwork City. The Clockwork City was to serve as a vessel for Sotha Sil to grant his people prolonged and improved lives through his creations, whether that be mechanical or mystic. His creations heavily drew resemblance from the Dwemer's machinery, but it was unique in its own sense. One of the major motivations for building such a metropolis was to cultivate an eventual movement against the Daedra through unified forces. Now, what was Sotha Sil's stance on the Aedra, the Divines? Well, his stance on the Aedra varied. He believed that their own creation, or in this case Nirn, came with its fair share of flaws, and he envisioned for the Clockwork City to be influential enough so it could rectify those aforementioned flaws. Sotha Sil took every factor needed for a self-sustained environment into consideration. His bigger project saw through the creation of the Celestial Dome and the Hall of Regulations. The Celestial Dome was a massive dome capable of mimicking day and night cycles, alongside granting the perception of a clear sky to anyone looking up at it, and this dome surrounded the entire realm and offered its inhabitants an artificially altered view of the skylight. The Hall of Regulations, on the other hand, undertook the services of basic necessities: proper humidity, drinkable water, temperature, and wind currents. I'm fully inclined on commenting how remarkable such a creation is. The city itself was fully mechanical, and once again resembling dwarven technology, which was altered by Sotha Sil himself, thus making them his designs. His inspiration obviously came from the Dwemer, tonal architects in particular. He was fascinated with their work and sought to refine it to his fullest capabilities. His research even allowed him to create humanoid automatons, and these were called factotums, and were utilized to maintain the structures of the Clockwork City. At first they were similar to the Dwarven automatons, but were eventually manifested into Sotha Sil's own design. Although the Clockwork City's wildlife and staff was explicitly mechanical, yes, you heard me correctly, automated wildlife, Sotha Sil even managed to recreate mechanical wildlife as to increase the levels of immersion the Clockwork City would emit, and these creatures would be called fabricants, part organic and part mechanical. Until his journey to the Isle of Artaeum, he mainly kept to himself and his research, rarely ever caring for the need of his mortal disciples. But his affinity towards mortals was always humble and calm, with fear and aggression rarely ever being preached. His physical departure to the Isle of Artaeum in an effort to aid the Psijic Order in their knowledge of the mystic was helpful to say the least, if not insanely progressive towards Tamriel's widespread knowledge of the arcane arts. Although helpful, his time on the Isle also landed him some quality alone time to refine his own research on Dwemer technology, but as expected, solace is never left uninterrupted. One day in particular, Almalexia suddenly dreamt of Morrowind losing the Fourscore War with Cyrodiil in the Second Era, and hastily went to the Isle of Artaeum to inform Sotha Sil of her visions. But her trip to Sotha was met with the sight of a mercilessly destroyed town, and this town was named Gildervale, located in Valenwood, and was entirely ravaged by Molag Bal, who was summoned shortly before its destruction. Almalexia couldn't stand to witness people wither away so brutally. She also knew how such news would strike Sotha Sil, a figure which was the victim of similar circumstances in his earlier years. After a short trip, Almalexia finally made it to Artaeum and informed Sotha Sil of her dream, alongside the news from Gildervale. The news of Gildervale most likely awoke an enigmatic part of Sotha's personality. It prompted him to employ the ability of most mages and sorcerers alike, contacting the Daedra personally.
Long ago I brokered a truce with the princes of Oblivion. This pact bound 8 princes to an oath that they would never again set foot on Tamriel.
Distant memories lingered in Sotha Sil's mind due to the realization of what the Daedra has done to another peaceful settlement. He was determined to put a stop to Daedric interferences temporarily, if not indefinitely. Sotha Sil entered the Dreaming Cavern on Artaeum, where he directly gained entrance to the secluded realm of Oblivion. His presence surprised every Daedric prince simultaneously, and the more prominent princes knew they couldn't risk attacking such a powerful deity. It would only lead to instability. So, they instead decided to listen to his terms of temporary peace in the form of a pact, and this pact would dictate that all of the currently present princes can't individually manifest themselves to wreak havoc on Tamriel, but that they had to use intermediaries such as witches and sorcerers to attack mortals until the Fourscore War between Morrowind and Cyrodiil was resolved. I can't imagine how Azura felt the moment she saw Sotha Sil in person. He was the sole proprietor that butchered the Chimer's oath to Azura. The pact was named the Cold Harbor Compact. The exact and specific terms of the pact are uncertain, but it has allowed Morrowind to successfully win the Fourscore War by allowing the Morag Tong to peacefully assassinate all of the Remen dynasty members. The Tribunal's reputation dwindled after this pact was realized. They were known as entities brave enough to personally deal with such a malignant threat. Years and years went by, and Morrowind's capital city, Mournhold, had established itself as a prosperous settlement, but its prosperity was ransacked by the summoning of Mehrunes Dagon, the sole Daedric prince who broke the Cold Harbor Compact. A Dunmer witch summoned Mehrunes Dagon, after which Dagon destroyed most of the city before being crushed into submission by the intervention of Sotha Sil and Almalexia. Sotha Sil finally came face to face in combat with the sole reason for his devastating childhood. He fully applied the hidden anger of the mental torment he endured living without a family into combat. Both Almalexia and him banished Mehrunes Dagon with ease, but were haunted by the thought of arriving after the capital of Morrowind disintegrated into ash.
bear the cruel weight of certainty. Total, absolute, relentless certainty. People rarely comprehend the luxury of doubt, the freedom that comes with indecision. I envy you.
There are many more events connected to him that either blessed or plagued his essence, but by the end of the Second Era, he himself has grown tired of his sole existence. The mental health he openly displayed was at a rapid decline, and this was most likely due to Dagoth hoarding all of the power from the Heart of Lorkhan for himself, but Sotha Sil always knew how to prepare for the inevitable. He knew that the Clockwork City heavily relied on his presence to function, but his goal was to implement a heart similar to the Heart of Lorkhan to collectively power the Clockwork City once he ceases to exist. Days would pass without anyone even confirming he's still present on Tamriel, but all he was focusing on was building his new creation, the Mechanical Heart, a mechanical replication of the Heart of Lorkhan, and this was to act as a mere replacement for his divinity and to subsequently power the Clockwork City in his absence. Initially, the creation of this heart proved to be unstable, and it was at one point powerful enough to eradicate the entire Clockwork City if not properly controlled. In order to restrain, control, and tap into the mechanical heart, Sotha Sil also created his own versions of Kagranak's tools, which would help him supervise the heart. The mechanical heart was stored in the Chamber of Lorkhan, located in the depths of the Clockwork City, as well as the tools, which were intricately hidden elsewhere. All of this tinkering and creating came with years of isolation and seclusion, which was exceedingly detrimental to his own mental health. His perseverance in giving the Clockwork City an assured future was a noble yet futile ambition nonetheless. Almalexia couldn't sit helplessly, waiting for mortality, so her and Sotha Sil ventured out to Red Mountain to defeat Dagoth lieutenants, but they were met with demigods even more powerful than both of them combined. They quickly lost the fight against Dagoth Odros and Dagoth Vemin, upon which they lost two of Kagranak's tools, Sunder and Keening. Shortly after, Vivek came to their rescue, and soon the Ghost Fence would be erected to stop Dagoth sphere of influence. Him and Almalexia were always the unstoppable duo, but not even they could have faced the fatality of Dagoth in his divine form. As a result of his failure against Dagoth's lieutenants, Sotha Sil retreated into his Clockwork City, spending his remaining days maintaining the Ghost Fence and passionately caring for the needs of his mortal disciples. The transition from enforcing unstoppable wisdom unto Tamriel to being chained down in hopes of preserving your own divinity deeply affected his mindset. What was a triumphant sense of confidence soon turned into subtle self-loathing. The less powerful he actually was, the more he was burdened by the stress of his people. His undivided care for mortals in the Third Era was perhaps a way for him to vent his grief and the horrors upon which his ascendance to divinity was founded. He felt as if the prized creation he spent centuries creating was built on an act of horrifying betrayal. All of his dreams consisted of recurring visions of prolonged silence and deep regret after betraying his closest brother in Doral Nerevar. This lingering mindset would eventually lead him to complete isolation by the end of his divinity, where he would be brutally murdered by his treasured duo, Almalexia. He knew of her maddening arrival beforehand, but chose to accept his fate regardless of the circumstances. Her arrival was met with Sotha Sil's physical appearance, but meanwhile, his state of mind was plugged into the dome of Sotha Sil, attempting to seal the Chamber of Lorkhan before he was murdered, and this would be his last contingency plan to ensure that the construction of his mechanical heart would continue fueling his legacy. Almalexia desecrated Sotha Sil's carcass, and her intent was to frame Sotha Sil by releasing his fabricants into Mournhold to ravage the city once more, in an effort to fool the Nerevarine into traveling to the Clockwork City to confront Sotha Sil, where he would be met by Almalexia instead. Fortunately for the Nerevarine, she was intensely weakened by the disappearance of her divinity, allowing the Nerevarine to slay her in self-defense. The Nerevarine made sure to remedy Sotha Sil's reputation by proclaiming what truly happened in the Clockwork City and how Almalexia tainted her own legacy as Mother Morrowind. Sotha Sil's legacy lived on even 207 years after his death, when the mechanical heart was fully functional. The Clockwork City would be powered by the heart up until mortal affairs finally concluded centuries of work in the Fourth Era.
The truth is that my actions, both good and evil, are inevitable, locked in time, determined by chains of action and consequence.
Sotha Sil's existence is tragic. He saw everything he ever strived for crumble into pieces. He resorted to solitude in the confines of his own creations as a way to cope with the inevitable stroke of rectification. Although tragic, he turned misery into partial prosperity. He turned helplessness into progressivism. He single-handedly created a self-sustained utopia capable of greatness. He taught the Dunmer immeasurable degrees of knowledge about the arcane arts. He was the center of wisdom, the light of knowledge. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one, I guess. Take care.
Strange. I spent lifetimes here in the world of tangible forms, but each time I emerge from the throne, it's like I'm seeing it for the first time. Broken, impoverished, beautiful.